Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the only show on the internet that bridges the gap between old school D&D monsters and your current 5th edition campaign. We've been talking about a lot of monsters that got their start in either 1st or 2nd edition D&D lately, and today we're going to continue that trend by talking about one of my favorite one-off monsters to ever see print, the Spanner. As you can see in their artwork, this creature is a living bridge that loves to throw people to an untimely demise. But they also have an incredibly interesting backstory with tons of plot hook potential. Way more than you might think. So as always, today we're going to go over this creature's publication history, lore, and ecology. Then we're going to convert it into 5th edition D&D and talk about how we might actually use this thing at the game table. So if you're ready to throw a spanner in your D&D campaign and see what happens, I welcome you to join me on this journey of burning bridges and getting over it, because it's time for Monster of the Week. In 1981, the UK division of TSR published the Fiend Folio for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This was widely regarded as a good move, and since it was so well received, over a decade later, in 1992, TSR released the AD&D 2nd edition Monstrous Compendium Fiend Folio Appendix. A title that just rolls off the tongue. The idea here was that this compendium would update and in some cases enhance all the monsters from the original Fiend Folio into 2nd edition. But it wasn't just a rehash of classic creatures, they would also add in a handful of new monsters, so longtime fans of the game had some new creatures to play with. And one of these new creatures, of course, would be the Spanner. Something great about a lot of these old compendiums is that in the front of the book it actually lists who designed which creatures. This is how I was able to track down Newton Ewell when I converted the Spirit Warrior, and it's also how we know who is responsible for the Spanner in all its glory. Chris and Steve Hardinger, you have my sincerest thanks for unleashing this monster onto the world. To my knowledge, this is the only D&D book that these two are credited on, but I guess when you come out the gate this strong, you might as well finish on top. Now at first glance, the Spanner is indistinguishable from a bridge. They vary in size, ranging from a small cobblestone walkway across a brook to a 200-foot long monster. For context, 200 feet is just over 14 stories. These bridges were originally created by an unnamed wizard who was experimenting on mimics to see if they could repurpose them somehow. The end result of these experiments, of course, was the Spanner. And ain't that just the most classic wizard shit that I've ever heard? Leave it to a wizard to accidentally make a living bridge. Now, of course, the Spanners eventually went walkabout and became integrated with the world around them as a new monstrous species. And before you get to thinking, oh, the Spanner is just a mimic in the shape of a bridge, let's address that. Don't think of this creature as a mimic variant, rather think about the mimic as an ingredient in this creature's creation. Unlike mimics, Spanners are not only as intelligent as your average human, but they have entire personalities as well. And as intelligent beings, there's basically no limit to how much one individual's personality might vary from another's. But overall, they tend to be fairly personable. They often love to gossip and generally go about collecting new juicy tidbits of information regarding the creatures who live nearby in one of two ways. Some Spanners are content to just listen in on the conversations being had by others as they walk across their back, choosing to remain silent and anonymous. Others take a more direct approach and will openly ask travelers to share stories with them as a sort of toll to cross the bridge. They don't seem to have many or possibly any physiological needs such as food or water, so a good tale is the bartering tool of choice if you want to get across the bridge. Speaking of their physiology, Spanners don't seem to have a natural upper limit on their lifespan, making them effectively biologically immortal. In the event that a Spanner is killed in combat, the creature simply just becomes inert and effectively causes them to become a normal bridge. And this is where the Spanner really starts to blur the lines between construct and creature. Back in 2nd edition, we didn't really have creature categories that worked the same way as what we've come to know ever since 3rd edition D&D. Usually, the creature's type is pretty obvious. A hyena is a beast, the pink dragon is a dragon, a golem is a construct. But once in a while, you'll come across a bizarre creature like this that can fit in one of the many different categories that exist. You could argue that the Spanner is simply a construct animated by magic, or as an intelligent creature that lives in the wild with some very obviously arcane traits. You could also argue that it's more of a monstrosity. Given its association with mimics, you could even argue that it's maybe a type of ooze. For me, in my conversion, I ended up landing on monstrosity as the creature type for the spanner, but feel free to let me know in the comments if you disagree. But regardless of what the creature's type actually lands on in your personal D&D campaign, in the interest of transparency, I want to talk about some of the ways that I altered this creature's design to make it a little bit more interesting, in my opinion. So let's talk about that. Mechanically, my version of this monster is pretty much a one-to-one conversion of the original creature, just updated to 5th edition. Most of what I changed actually has very little to do with the mechanics of the creature and more to do with its visual design. In the original printing, the only artwork that exists of this creature depicts it as literally just a sentient arched bridge. Don't get me wrong, that's totally cool and completely fine. But it did get me thinking that maybe there is a way to make this creature a little bit more involved. I actually have the creature's artist to thank for this one, because when I was chatting with Tam about getting some new, fresh, updated artwork for the spanner, it was their idea to give it eye stalks and make it a bit more insectile in its appearance, like a giant centipede. This led us down the path trying to figure out how to modify the spanner while maintaining its core concept, and I think Tam did an awesome job on the final design. Personally, I love the way that this looks, and I think it gives the creature a lot more personality. Because while laying inert, of course, it will still look like just any old bridge. However, by giving the creature retractable eyes and these little stone legs that can be easily hidden, I think it makes the monster a bit more visually interesting and somewhat less goofy, while still maintaining a somewhat silly spirit that was attached with the original monster's entry. And the best part about this, in my opinion, is that it is, for the most part, an entirely visual change. It's all descriptive, so if you don't like this, or you just like the idea of it being a sentient bridge that hobbles back and forth, you can just describe it to your players that way and you do not have to use the new artwork. The only way this actually impacted the mechanics of the creature is that now, since it has these little legs, I gave the monster a climb speed because that just makes sense to me. And I will admit, the addition of the eye stalks and its little feet is part of what made me lean more towards monstrosity when figuring out what type of monster I wanted this to be. I don't know what it is, there's just something about giving it eyes that changes the whole dynamic of this monster for me. Please let me know what you think about this, because while this is less of a change than, say, the Chrono Tyrant and how we kind of reworked that whole thing a few months back, I do think that this is surprisingly impactful in regards to how this creature will be perceived by the players. So let me know. But with all that said, let's move on and talk about what kind of abilities this living walkway actually has access to. As you would expect, a creature with a hide made of stone is going to have a colossal AC sitting at 18. For a CR5 monster, that's pretty dang good. But that said, the trade-off here is that this creature does have a slower move speed with only 20 feet per round, meaning that if you do get in combat with one of these things and you feel like you can't take it on, the best option is gonna be to just run away. But if you do find yourself in combat with the spanner, honestly, it's probably your fault to begin with. Spanners are notoriously averse to battle and would almost always rather settle a dispute with words over violence. But when push comes to shove, it does have a couple brutal tricks up its sleeve. The first is less of a trick and more of you getting crushed by a bridge. It can make 2 slam attacks per round that each clock in for 2d10 plus 3 damage, which at lower levels can be pretty rough. But the real threat of the spanner only actually enters into play if you begin combat while you're on the creature's back. At the start of each turn, the spanner can force somebody on its body to make a DC 16 dexterity check. If you fail, it either rocks back and forth, hurling you over the side of the bridge, or opens up a hole beneath your feet, causing you to fall straight down. In either case, depending on how high up off the ground you are, this can either be a minor inconvenience or certain death. Meaning that if you ever decide to literally cross paths with a spanner, you better make sure you're on good terms before taking that first step across the bridge. Outside of that, surprising basically no one, there isn't a lot that the spanner can do. I mean, what do you expect? It's a living bridge. It can do living bridge stuff. If you really wanted to make this a more deadly and challenging encounter, you could always increase the number of creatures it can affect with its ability to throw them off the side or shoot them down below. Maybe instead of only being able to affect one creature per turn, it can affect anybody who's on its back, potentially sending the entire party careening into the abyss. Or you could even increase its speed, give it a ranged attack where it hurls bricks from its body at people, or allow it to sunder the ground beneath it to create an earthquake if it's not hanging over a giant gap of some kind. There's a lot of different things you could add if you're interested in ratcheting up the danger, but to be fully honest, 9 times out of 10, this is likely going to be a roleplay encounter. But I mean, it's always good to have a plan in case things turn ugly. Speaking of which, let's talk about a few ways this might pan out and go over a few plot hooks. The first thing I want to talk about is how truly camouflaged the spanner actually is in its unmoving state. Due to its false appearance trait, while remaining entirely motionless, it is indistinguishable from an ordinary bridge. We've seen monsters with this trait before, such as the Trent or the Mimic. But something I always like to consider when this trait comes up is what are some circumstances in which a player might actually notice something is off. For example, if a player decides unprompted to just investigate the bridge, take a closer look before they cross, and they roll ridiculously high on their check, what sort of things might they notice? As per the trait, they're not going to just notice, oh, this is a creature, but there can always be context clues to tip them off. Maybe there are marks in the ground on one side of the bridge indicating something really heavy passed over here recently. Or perhaps the bridge itself seems to be made of stone that doesn't correspond to the rock typically used by masons in this region. If you want to give them a real hot tip, maybe the bridge itself has something odd about its construction. Perhaps it doesn't have a keystone, which should raise a lot of red flags for anyone who knows anything about architecture in the party. This can be especially interesting if the one investigating the bridge is a dwarf due to their stone cunning trait. They might get all sorts of bad vibes about the bridge itself. How much you want to give the players here is definitely up to you as the dungeon master, but I would at least be prepared to give them something. Because if a player rolls stupid high on an investigation check and then gleans nothing of the situation, and then the spanner attacks, or it turns out that the spanner is revealed to them in some way to be a real magical creature, they're gonna feel bad. But in terms of actually using the spanner as a plot element, I think that this is a really diverse creature with a lot of options. Anytime bridges come up in D&D, I always immediately think of trolls.
Troll! In the dungeon! Troll in the dungeon!
Trolls are the de facto toll collectors of most fantasy worlds, and I could see a really interesting encounter where the spanner has formed a sort of symbiotic relationship with a troll that has taken up residence beneath its body. The two of them might stay in one place, or maybe they travel the countryside, setting up shop near bustling towns whenever a grand festival or something is about to take place. The troll, of course, actively extorts any travelers for treasure, and if things get feisty, the spanner jumps in to help defend the troll. By the time any local knights are dispatched to deal with the troll, the pair has already moved on and suddenly there just isn't a bridge there anymore. And if your party isn't ready to handle a troll, maybe a spanner is doing this extortion routine all by themselves, hoarding treasure for some unknown reason. Perhaps the bridge has even adopted a pack of kobolds or something, and it's using the money to buy food and supplies for them. That honestly isn't even too far-fetched from the creature's basic lore. As creatures originally created to safeguard an area from intruders, they often adopt towns and villages as people under their protection. A spanner that has lived in a particular region for a long time likely knows many of the people who might live nearby and is bound to have friendships and connections with many of the folks who travel the road regularly. The spanner might be a vocal member of the community even, or perhaps it keeps its true nature mostly concealed, only revealing itself to a select few individuals. Maybe it's made friends with a local eccentric hedge wizard who will gleefully claim the bridge is alive to anyone that will listen, but of course, people just write them off as a madman because the bridge chooses to remain silent when anyone else is around, either because it doesn't trust them or maybe it just wants to mess with the wizard. And if you happen to be planning an adventure that takes place in a wizard's tower or a similar location like that, you could use this creature as it was originally intended to be used, as the first encounter, the sort of guardian protecting the path to that place. But whatever the case, they're great to have around for pretty much everyone because they don't eat anything, and as long as they're friendly to the villagers or whoever happens to be living nearby, they can be a great protector. Should bandits ever try to cross the bridge and make their way towards town, they might be in for a nasty surprise once they get across the bridge. Or rather, once they get halfway across the bridge. Now, as per the original rules, these creatures max out in size around 200 feet long, but as we all know, rules are more like guidelines. Perhaps there's an exceptionally long-lived spanner that began its life in a small town among a group of peasants, and that town slowly grew and grew and grew, and now it is a large capital city and potential seat of power. Over time, what started as this small stone bridge has grown to a colossal marvel of engineering. Maybe there's even a local legend of a guardian spirit who lives on the bridge and protects travelers as they come and go from the city. And within this myth, as is often the case, there lies a singular grain of truth. The bridge isn't haunted by a guardian spirit, but rather it is a sentient living being that watches over the city at all times, only ever speaking to a select few it counts among friends. And who knows what kind of information a spanner that's lived that long might have access to. It could know all manner of secrets about the kingdom, the people within it, and maybe even a few plot-relevant details to your ongoing campaign story. As we know, spanners love gossip, so if you're doing a political intrigue style game in a high magic setting, having the spanner be the sort of go-to gossip girl of the city, so to speak, could be really interesting and very silly. Even if you don't want to go with the massive bridge thing though, a very old spanner would likely have lots of insight into ages gone by. So even a relatively small spanner that's lived in a single area for its entire life, which could be hundreds or even thousands of years, would likely know all sorts of stuff that nobody else would have any recollection of. But no matter how you choose to use this creature, I sincerely hope you get a chance to run one of them at a game table sometime, because they are just a joy to use in a roleplay encounter at the very least. It's just another one of those weird little hidden gems packed away in D&D's history. I'm so glad I got to talk about it today. I want to give a special shout out to all of you fantastic patrons out there who help make this show possible, and a special shout out to our Patron of the Week. This week's randomly selected patron is Matthias Haas. This has to be one of my favorite episodes yet, and I appreciate you helping me make it. As always, if you do want to use this monster in your campaign, a link in the description down below is a link to a Google document that contains all the information you will need to successfully run this creature at your game table. And if you are one of those aforementioned lovely patrons, over on the Patreon page, you can find the Dungeon Dad style stat block. It is a high-res PDF document that contains all the same information, but it's got the new artwork. It's in a real neat layout situation, gives you something cool to bust out at the game table, and it helps support the show, helps keep all my hot lights turned on. I ordered more of them, by the way. Keying out the green screen sucks sometimes, it's not good, so there's more hot lights on the way, everybody. Yay! Also, if there's a monster you'd like to see converted into D&D 5th edition from an older version of the game, or even a different RPG altogether, and you want to see it talked about on the channel here, let me know in the comments down below, or on the Dungeon Dad Discord and the Monster Suggestions channel, and who knows, you might just see it show up on a future episode of Monster of the Week. As we broach the second half of September, I will remind you all that spooky season is coming, so give me your best horror-themed monster recommendations. As is tradition throughout the month of October, we will be talking about some more scary and spooky and gross-themed creatures. I want to give you all the tools I can to prepare you for your Halloween one-shots. Anyways, that's all I've got for you this week. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next one. Till then.
The leaves are changing color. A chill can be felt in the air. Your neighbor has a 30-foot skeleton on their lawn. That can only mean one thing. Spooky season is upon us. It's a crying shame we have to kick things off with such a horrific creature. Next episode, Weep. Tune in next time for lots more fan service.